Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named The Twilight Zone, 1985, Season 3. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The first story begins with a man named Miley simply taking a matchbox from an old man, only to find strange writing on it, something called the Hellgramite method. It was said to solve alcohol problems. He still wanted to ask the old man for more details, but when he turned around, he was already gone with his elderly figure. Miley slipped the matchbox into his pocket and continued drinking. His friend reminded him that the pizza was getting cold, but Miley didn't care at all, downing one drink after another, lost in the sea of alcohol. Then he awoke in pain, his face contorted from the table. The tavern had reached the sampling hour, and Miley had no choice but to grab the pizza and head home. His originally planned dinner was now 5 hours late. Facing his wife's cold stare, he thought warming the pizza would be enough. Just as he was about to get angry, their son came out. He had school tomorrow. Miley finally felt ashamed. His mind was still clouded by alcohol, and this was his wife's final ultimatum. He followed the address from the matchbox and knocked on the door. The old man named Dr. Eugene welcomed him inside. The box mentioned a Hellgramite antidote. Just then, he spotted a bottle of alcohol nearby. After pouring himself a drink, Miley began talking about his frequent hangovers. He was a full-blown alcoholic, and any treatments he'd tried lasted only 2 or 3 months at most. He loved drinking, but hated it at the same time. Dr. Eugene said he could help. He had a unique method. Dr. Eugene opened a black box, and inside were red capsules. Miley casually took one. Just as he was about to swallow it, Dr. Eugene warned him. Once he used this method, there was no turning back. Miley thought things couldn't get worse, so he swallowed the pill. After confirming he had taken it, Dr. Eugene told him to go get some sleep. Miley asked how much it cost, and Dr. Eugene replied that the first treatment was free. If he chose to continue, they would discuss payment. The next morning, Miley was getting ready to leave for work and wanted to apologize to his wife. Their son interrupted again, and Miley hurriedly promised to talk that evening, assuring her that everything would change. But inside, his wife was unmoved. That evening, Miley returned to the tavern. This time, he wanted something stronger, whiskey. After downing the last glass, his friend looked at him in shock. No one had ever drunk so much and still stayed sober. Miley felt something was wrong. His brain couldn't feel anything. That's when he remembered the red capsule. He returned to the consultation room where Dr. Eugene explained the details of the treatment. The red capsule contained a Hellgramite worm, a rare magnetic worm that had now attached itself to Miley's stomach. At first, he thought it was a joke, but Dr. Eugene seriously warned him that drinking alcohol would stimulate the worm's growth, causing it to absorb all the alcohol. Seeing Miley still in disbelief, Dr. Eugene opened a cabinet. Inside, something was submerged in a jar. Miley leaned in slowly, and to his horror, it was a partially grown Hellgramite worm. He couldn't hold it together any longer. The realization hit him that such a thing was inside his body. Dr. Eugene reminded him that no matter how much alcohol he drank, the worm would never be satisfied. If he tried to quit drinking, the pain would be unbearable. Miley wondered if there was a way to get rid of it, but even the best doctors couldn't do that. The only solution was to stop drinking altogether. The worm would enter a dormant state and wait to feed. Every time it was awakened, it would grow stronger until it eventually killed its host. Miley felt his stomach twist in pain. Drinking would relieve it, but that would mean he was signing his own death sentence. Looking at the Happy Family album, he finally made up his mind, not just for himself, but for his wife and son. Miley first asked his wife to take their son and stay with her family for a while. He needed to solve this problem once and for all. After closing the door behind them, he gathered his collection of treasured alcohol and, with great difficulty, poured it all down the drain. His stomach screamed with desperate longing, and he even wanted to lick the alcohol off his hand, but he quickly turned on the faucet. Just a little more contact with it would undo everything. At that moment, the phone rang. His wife's voice came through, repeatedly asking about her husband's condition, but Miley didn't answer. He remained silent until she hung up. With empty eyes, he curled up on the bed. If he wanted to drink, all he had to do was fill his stomach with water, but it didn't help ease the ache in his gut. He desperately tried to sober up, but the craving was overpowering. Dr. Eugene seemed quite satisfied with this. Miley didn't continue to complain. He just panted heavily. Dr. Eugene picked up a photo from the table. If Miley had been able to quit drinking sooner, he wouldn't have lost his wife and child. The pain he felt now was nothing compared to what he had lost. What Miley wanted was a second chance. He had already made his choice. It was either face life anew with the help of alcohol or drink himself to death, consumed by the worm. But the craving grew even stronger. Miley's body trembled uncontrollably. Even lighting a cigarette became a struggle, and despite taking a deep drag, he couldn't calm himself down. When he returned to the faucet to drink more water, the pain in his stomach became unbearable. The worm inside began to thrash violently, as if desperately trying to break free. It felt like a rebellion within his body. He had to press his hand against his stomach, screaming in agony. Afterward, Miley was having a nightmare in bed, surrounded by voices in his ears. He couldn't take it anymore, and began rummaging through the kitchen, desperately searching for something to stop the pain. Finally, he found a small bottle of alcohol. His rational mind told him not to, but his body wouldn't listen. He gripped the bottle in his hand, then let out a gut-wrenching scream. Back at the familiar bar, a man sat at his old spot. Miley wanted to light a cigarette, and someone behind him handed him a match. It was Miley himself. His face was no longer pale, and he appeared calm and composed. He handed over a white matchbox to the man, who took it in confusion, and Miley turned and walked away. After settling the bar tab, his friend offered him a free drink, but Miley smiled and shook his head, suggesting that he had successfully quit drinking. The sunlight outside was bright and brilliant. There were no shortcuts, no easy paths to peace of mind. The second story begins with an elderly Selena, who was the matriarch of a wealthy family but now nearing death. However, her relative, Diane, didn't seem the least bit worried. After finishing his diagnosis, Dr. Burrell could only prescribe some painkillers. Selena grabbed his arm desperately, saying she didn't want to die, but the doctor knew there was nothing he could do. She wouldn't last long. Diane wasn't surprised. Instead, she asked if the doctor would be back tomorrow and that they could go out for a drink. Burrell nodded. If Selena was still alive tomorrow, he would certainly return. Diane quickly followed him outside, saying Selena wouldn't die tonight. Burrell was confused. Selena was a dying woman, and that wasn't something anyone could control. Meanwhile, a girl named Deborah received a letter from her aunt asking her to return to the family estate to take care of her. Though Deborah had never been favored by the family, her aunt was nearing death, and perhaps she would inherit something. Upstairs in the mansion, a woman stared blankly out the window while Diane showed Deborah around the house. The only servant was deaf from a young age and unable to hear any gossip. Diane joked with him, but Deborah didn't find it funny. As they passed the room on the second floor, Deborah wondered who the woman at the window was. Diane explained that it was her mother, who spent all her time sitting in a chair, staring out the window, indifferent to life. Meanwhile, Dr. Burrell finished administering Selena's injection. Deborah approached her aunt, eager to help. Selena slowly extended her hand, and to everyone's surprise, she pressed her thumb forcefully onto Deborah's hand. Deborah winced in pain and quickly pushed her hand away, confused by the strange action. Selena closed her eyes with satisfaction. Deborah asked Dr. Burrell how her aunt could still have such strength. Burrell speculated that it might be a phenomenon where a person who's about to die uses some final burst of energy to hold on as though waiting for something. Seeing Deborah's stunned expression, Burrell realized he'd said too much. Deborah assured him it was fine, and Burrell emphasized that no matter the value of the inheritance, health was the most important thing. Meanwhile, Diane was watching them intently from behind the door. That evening, the mansion felt eerily strange. The spot where Deborah had been pinched earlier had turned dark black. Earlier, Burrell had diagnosed it as a liver spot, rare in young people but completely benign. Still, Deborah was puzzled, wondering why it had appeared so suddenly. Maybe it was due to too much sun exposure, and with some whitening cream it would clear up soon. She didn't think much more about it. Then Diane entered the room with Dr. Burrell, and both were stunned. Not only was Selena still alive, but she seemed more alert, even able to speak, and her heartbeat appeared steadier. Burrell began to doubt his initial diagnosis and decided to come back the next day for a follow-up. At that moment, Deborah, having just finished tidying up the dishes, suddenly felt lightheaded. Her hands started shaking uncontrollably. Weakly, she leaned on one hand to support herself. Diane, hearing the noise, entered the room and suggested she lie down to rest. After Deborah left the room, Selena slowly opened her eyes, and Diane gave an eerie smile. Just then, Burrell was jolted awake by a phone call. Deborah barely had time to explain, only urging him to come to the family estate as soon as possible. Later, Dr. Burrell stood in front of Deborah, who was hiding in the shadows. He noticed her aged hand and immediately suggested she go to the hospital for some tests, but none of the examinations revealed anything concrete. The results only pointed to premature aging. Dr. Burrell decided to visit the family estate again. Diane said that she felt fine, and Selena had no issues either. Her mother simply sat on the couch, staring blankly out the window. As Dr. Burrell continued to observe, he noticed a scar on Diane's arm. Diane explained that it was from her childhood. Just as Burrell was still puzzling over this, Selena's voice came from behind. She was now able to move around in a wheelchair. Burrell immediately sensed something was wrong. There was an odd coincidence. Deborah was showing signs of premature aging, while Selena seemed to be growing stronger. Selena didn't continue the conversation. She said they no longer needed an incompetent doctor. The bill would be sent to Burrell's office, and as for Deborah, she would receive the best care in the family. Frustrated, Dr. Burrell turned to leave. As he stepped outside, the servant motioned for him to come over. Burrell walked over, puzzled, and the servant quickly handed him a wrapped item. It was a diary, and he pointed to the most important page. It was dated July 17th, 1940, describing how a picnic was ruined by a fire and a horse had knocked over a lantern, burning only Martha, who was Diane's mother. Burrell suddenly felt uneasy. The servant nodded. There was a photo, and the right arm of the person in the picture was wrapped in bandages, a wound that would last for the rest of the person's life. If only Martha had been burned, why did her daughter Diane have the same scar in the same spot? Burrell decided to investigate that night, and by then, Deborah had aged drastically, just like Selena had before. That night, Dr. Burrell sneaked into the room and rolled up Diane's sleeve. Sure enough, there was the same scar. He quickly grabbed a lantern and shone the light on it. Burrell realized that Diane and Martha's identities had been swapped. Martha stole the life force from her daughter, causing Diane to age quickly and be the weak woman, staring blankly out of the window. There seemed to be some kind of deal, and perhaps Selena knew more. The real Martha angrily confronted Burrell, but before she could stop him, he rushed into the room, revealing that Selena was getting younger by the day. It was all because she had stolen Deborah's youth. Burrell angrily condemned this as wrong, but Selena was unfazed. To her, it was a game of longevity, unrelated to morals or family. Once disease and death took over the body, she didn't care what happened to anyone else. Martha struck him with a forceful blow, and Burrell fell to the ground in pain. After dodging another attack, they grappled fiercely on the floor. The real Diane slowly entered the room, holding a lantern and calling out for her mother. Martha, terrified, stumbled back, pushing her daughter away. In the process, the lantern fell, and in an instant, the flames ignited her. The fire quickly spread through the house. Selena was trapped inside, screaming for help. Burrell rushed to save her, but realized the smoke was too thick to get close. He had to run outside alone. By the time the firefighters arrived in the morning, the fire was finally under control. The bodies of Selena and Diane were pulled from the wreckage. Martha had escaped through a broken window and was now listed as missing. A person badly burned by fire couldn't survive for long. Dr. Burrell decided he didn't want to be involved any further. Deborah had just returned from the hospital, her face filled with confusion. Burrell recounted the events of the previous night. Meanwhile, in a hospital room, 2 doctors examined a patient who had suffered extensive burns and had little hope of recovery. However, there was one odd detail. Her left arm seemed to be healing at an unusually fast rate. The doctors didn't investigate further. Nearby, a nurse's left arm also bore burn scars, which suggests that her life force had been stolen by Martha, the survivor of that terrible fire. The third story begins with Norman living a life of isolation, trapped in a cage called loneliness, facing the silence of day and night. The only sound was the television programs. One night, Norman woke up from the sofa and suddenly heard a phone call for a limited edition album cassette. He quickly wrote down the number and eagerly dialed it. A soft woman's voice answered, saying he had dialed the wrong number. The woman had been worried the call would disconnect before she could answer, but Norman didn't quite catch her meaning. He kept apologizing for the disturbance. After a brief silence, they quickly exchanged names, not their hormones yet. The woman's name was Mary Ann, and by chance, she had picked up the call. Norman hesitantly asked if they could continue talking, if she wasn't busy. Mary Ann gladly agreed. The next day, Norman went to work, but he couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. They had spoken for over an hour the night before. Strangely, Mary Ann didn't feel like a stranger to him. She had been a little nervous at first, but soon it felt like talking to an old friend. Norman hadn't felt this happy in a long time, and he wanted his colleagues' opinions on it. Mary Ann said she'd be available at 7 p.m., and Norman was eager to meet her. His colleague, on the other hand, insisted he needed peace and quiet. With 5 kids at home, silence was a rare luxury. Norman decided not to push the matter further. The colleague didn't want to hurt his feelings, but suggested that if Norman wanted to meet Mary Ann, he should just ask her. If she wasn't interested, there was no point in spending so much time chatting. Norman thought this was a reasonable idea. He sat with his alarm clock in hand, waiting, and when the time came, he immediately picked up the phone. They talked for 3 hours without even realizing it. Mary Ann had enjoyed their conversation, and using this as an opportunity, Norman asked if they could meet, whether for lunch or dinner anytime, anywhere. anywhere, but Marianne firmly declined. They'd had a great time chatting, so why change that? She was perfectly content with how things were. Norman felt disappointed but agreed. Marianne suggested they talk again the next day, and Norman promised they would. After they hung up, Norman returned to work. His colleague had been eerily silent for 5 days straight. Finally, Norman brought up the strange situation, how they could talk for hours on the phone, but Marianne refused to meet. His colleague gave him another suggestion. Based on what Norman knew, just a name and a phone number, he could contact the operator and tell them there was an urgent matter preventing him from reaching her, and the operator might give him an address. The next step was up to Norman. He followed the address to the art gallery where the call had been made. At the front desk, he asked about Marianne. The woman wasn't sure if such a person worked there, though she speculated that Marianne could have been an intern or a volunteer. To find out more, Norman would have to speak to the gallery's director. So he wandered around for a while, and that's when he spotted a phone nearby. Maybe he could try dialing the number again. He entered the familiar digits, and the phone rang nearby. Norman followed the sound to another part of the gallery where the landline was still ringing. He picked it up. It was the same phone they'd used for their nightly calls. But this time, Marianne didn't answer. Just as he was wondering what was going on, he noticed a bronze statue in front of him. A woman's voice came from behind him. She began telling him the story of the statue, explaining that it was Marianne's last self-portrait. The craftsmanship was exceptional, and they had lost a special artist. The woman revealed that Marianne had chosen to end her life. Norman was shocked. The woman speculated that it could have been due to an argument with a lover, but she didn't provide any details. As Norman processed this, his skin prickled when he heard Marianne's name. Marianne was the statue, but how could she be speaking to him? Holding the photo he had gotten from the art gallery, Norman hesitated for a long time. Finally, he dialed the number. The familiar voice came through the line saying she knew he had been here and she heard his conversation with that woman. Norman couldn't believe it. The woman he had fallen for was a statue, but as he calmed down and looked at the photo again, he dialed the number once more. He apologized for his earlier actions. On the other end of the line, he heard crying. The voice said she should be the one apologizing because she shouldn't have answered the phone in the first place. She had just been so lonely. It's been so long since she had talked to anyone. Norman could understand that feeling. He lived his own kind of solitude. Marianne thought he was just comforting her, and she was about to hang up. Even though Norman begged her to stay on the line, she ended the call. It was no wonder she had always refused to meet. After learning the truth, even talking had become a luxury. Even at work, Norman couldn't stop thinking about Marianne. His life of loneliness had been shattered, and he could no longer adjust. He found himself constantly looking at the phone, the photo by his bedside. He finally gathered the courage to call again, but this time there was no answer. The next morning, Norman went straight to the art gallery and sat down in front of Marianne. They were both creatures of solitude. Marianne made him feel like someone needed him, and suddenly, life had color again. He looked forward to their conversations every day. Over time, it became the only reason he came home. Norman had once felt like he had nothing, like if he disappeared from the world, no one would even notice or question it. But when Marianne appeared, he fell genuinely in love for the first time in his life. Without Marianne, he would have nothing. Just then, a tear slipped from Marianne's eye. Norman reached forward to wipe it away and almost kissed her, but a staff member stepped in to stop him. Reluctantly saying goodbye, Norman left. As he was walking away, Marianne's right eye grew wet. That night, Norman fell asleep like a pig on the sofa. Suddenly, the phone rang. He rushed to answer it. It was Marianne's voice again. She had struggled to dial the number in the dark, but finally got through. She said she had been afraid to lose this connection too, but she couldn't keep suffering like this. Ever since he had been willing to talk to her, she hadn't been able to handle the loneliness anymore since she was already in love with him. After hearing this confession, Marianne no longer hesitated. She told Norman to come to the gallery tonight. She assured him there was no need to worry about whether the doors would be locked. They would stay open until she changed her mind. Norman immediately left his place. The locked gate creaked as he entered. He stumbled through the dark, calling out for Marianne. She was sitting in her usual spot. Norman approached her. Just then, the security guard heard the noise and noticed someone had broken in. As Norman grabbed Marianne's hand, the guard arrived, but all he found were 2 statues. Even the statues, once part of a special exhibit about loneliness, had found love in a soft, symmetrical form, bridging the gap between the realms of darkness and light. The 5th story begins with Dr. Craig encountering a strange patient named Sharon. She not only refused to leave her house, but also arranged her furniture in bizarre ways. She refused to sleep anywhere except in a simple white room. According to the nurse, Sharon had repainted the room 6 times because she couldn't stand the spots and cracks on the walls. Craig had never heard of such a thing, but Sharon seemed like a normal person, just deeply frightened. Craig decided to meet her before the end of the day. He entered the simple room where Sharon was sitting on the couch, reading a book and showing no signs of abnormal behavior. Craig briefly explained the case. Sharon was willing to undergo treatment, but 2 months had passed, and she still hadn't started. She strongly resisted the treatment, so Craig decided not to press the issue. Not long after he left, the nurse entered with a blanket, and a heart-wrenching chicken scream echoed from the room. The nurse explained helplessly that there were no other thick blankets, but Sharon had a severe aversion to patterns. It wasn't until Craig suggested they buy some solid-colored ones that Sharon finally began to calm down, and Craig let out a sigh of relief. The next day, Sharon came to see him. After his kind gesture the night before, she decided to give it a try, but only after moving the rug aside. Craig quickly rolled it up. Sharon finally shared her story. She had gotten married right after graduating from college and had a son, now 7 years old. She neither hated her parents nor was bullied by her brothers, nor had she been frightened by patterns as a child. But Craig saw how the rug frightened her. Sharon clarified that it wasn't the blanket itself, but the pattern. She hesitated, unsure whether anyone would believe her, but Craig was eager to hear her out. She explained how the patterns were everywhere, on wallpaper and ceilings, combining cracks and colors in such a way that she could relax. But if you looked closely, you could see a face. Craig thought this was a childhood fantasy, the brain trying to impose order on chaos, which led to what she called a ghostly face. Sharon then asked why it had to be a face and not an animal or a plant. Craig was left speechless. No one had ever really thought about it. That night, Sharon lay in bed, watching as the shadows on the wallpaper formed patterns. At that moment, a face seemed to emerge from the wall, staring at her. The moment she looked away, it disappeared. Craig assumed it was just a figment of her imagination, a misinterpretation of the pattern. But Sharon insisted it was a sensation. When two sets of eyes meet, you can feel if you're being watched. That's when she had felt it. Craig theorized it was just her brain reorganizing itself into different patterns, so it wasn't really a face at all. Sharon was certain she had seen something, and that face wanted to kill her. Meanwhile, Craig listened to the morning's recording, trying to find an answer. His hand kept drawing faces on paper, but after thinking it through, he dismissed the idea. Sharon, since the day she saw the face, had felt watched by the carpet, the wallpaper on the ceiling. She tried painting over them, but they still kept emerging. She had to stop wearing patterned clothes and forbid any patterns in her room. Recently, whispers had started to appear. Someone was deciding to do something to Sharon. Craig was puzzled, asking who they were. Sharon had a sense they were somewhere, watching her, but feelings alone weren't convincing, and Sharon didn't want to say more. At that moment, Sharon was having a nightmare. In her dream, she was still lying in bed, reading a book. Suddenly, a flash of lightning struck, cutting the power, and whispers echoed nearby. At first, Sharon thought she must have been imagining things, but then a ghostly face appeared on the wall. She fought to keep her fear in check, stood up, and pressed her hand against the wall, but found nothing unusual. Then, a ghostly face appeared again, slowly moving as if trying to break free. Just when Sharon thought things had calmed down, more faces emerged, letting out a series of horrifying growls. As the faces left the room, Sharon suddenly remembered her sleeping son. She rushed to his room and found him unharmed. With a sigh of relief, she let go of her worries, but the next second, the wallpaper was torn open in strips and the cracks formed a message, threatening him not to tell anyone. Sharon immediately woke up from the nightmare, wetting herself. Outside, the rain was pouring down in torrents, and at that moment, Craig received a wet phone call. Sharon had changed her mind. She no longer wanted to go on like this, and Craig was left confused. But the truth was, Sharon had lied. She already knew what the ghostly faces were, and she knew their purpose. Before Craig could respond, Sharon hung up the phone. After a night of heavy rain, the rehab center was filled with buckets. The nurse explained that Sharon had screamed in the middle of the night, demanding to be moved to another room. Craig sensed something was wrong. There were no extra rooms, and the nurse couldn't let Sharon disturb the other patients, so they had to lock her door. Craig was furious that she hadn't called sooner, and he quickly rushed over. As fate would have it, he ran into Sharon. He apologized for the nurse's actions, but Sharon simply said she was foolish for being scared of the storm. She had wanted to say goodbye to Dr. Craig. She had decided to leave the rehab center. Craig thought it was for the best, but then his eyes caught something. Sharon was wearing clothes with a complicated pattern on her shoulders. Sharon explained that she had made peace with it and then turned to leave. As she packed her things, Craig offered to help with her luggage, but just then they heard whispers nearby. The sound was fleeting, and Sharon claimed she hadn't heard it, probably just the wind, but Craig kept his eyes on the ceiling, where water droplets were falling through the cracks. Sharon smiled and handed him the luggage and Craig left. After noticing nothing unusual, Sharon slowly looked up at the spot on the ceiling where water was leaking and mold had begun to form. It turns out the Sharon we knew was long gone. She was trapped and could only cry out for help from within the walls. That faint sound could only be heard by a few. When you're all alone, you have to be wary of the cracks in the wallpaper and ceiling. Perhaps it wasn't just water leaking, it might have been someone's tears silently falling from the corner of their eyes. The sixth story begins with a washed-up soldier named Alex gently pressing the button when a blinding light shone from behind the metal door, revealing a square opening. This had originally been just a laboratory, but during research on wormhole theories in the subspace corridor, this large door had unexpectedly appeared. No one knew where it led, or even how it came to be. The only thing they could do was keep it open with the equipment, as it might not be able to open again once closed. Alex took a curious look at the door in front of him. He needed to find out what was on the other side of the wall, so the general ordered him to go in and investigate. Alex didn't feel much. He wasn't the first to go through. 4 others had already volunteered to cross over, including a captain, all of them equipped with the best gear. But after passing through the door, none of them had returned. The general looked helpless. He believed the others were still alive. If there had been any other choice, he wouldn't have sent Alex in. Alex was a good soldier, always ready to obey orders, to the point that his wife had left him. Now, he had nothing left to lose. The technicians adjusted the equipment, and Alex suited up in a heavy protective suit. After confirming the oxygen supply was functioning, he stepped forward. The metal door slowly opened, and once again, blinding light flooded out. The general reminded him to take a look around and come straight back. Alex confirmed the recording device was on, then stepped through the door. The white light was intense, and he immediately felt a strange distortion. Back with the general, the signal began to fade. Alex trembled more intensely as his body was completely enveloped. Soon, he found himself lying on the grass, regaining his senses. He immediately tried to call, but no matter how much he shouted, there was no response from the general. He got up and began to search, quickly discovering a matching pair of white gloves. The 4 others must be nearby. The atmospheric conditions were similar to Earth's, and as he tried to remove his helmet, the oxygen seemed better than expected. The air here was cool, and Alex suddenly remembered the door. He turned around but found it gone. He had no choice but to move forward. On the other side, things were in chaos. Attempts to boost the signal didn't help. The general finally lost his composure. At that moment, Alex suddenly encountered the captain, who had been missing for a long time. The captain said he had been waiting for Alex. Alex was confused, but the woman invited him to come with her, promising that everything would be explained. Half in doubt, Alex followed, only to find a group of people ahead. They were using animal power to plow the land in medieval-style buildings. Alex was puzzled, asking where this place was. The captain excitedly explained this was heaven. Alex stood there, stunned, as the 4 of them integrated into the small town, and time seemed to slow down. The people around him began to explain. In truth, the scientists had all been wrong. This wasn't Earth, nor was it anywhere known to them. They had tried various methods, but the door had disappeared. Perhaps it was a one-way portal. The woman was the leader here, and they were a peaceful people. They had enough to share and didn't have to worry about food. This place wasn't the prison they had imagined. They were glad Alex had come, as he was a man of integrity. This was the place they had dreamed of. Alex kept his doubts, refusing to make a final judgment until he had fully investigated the situation. The leader encouraged him to explore the area and promised to help as much as possible. Alex still felt something was off, but the reality was undeniable. His investigation yielded no results by the end of the morning, and the door appeared to be gone. Slowly, Alex started to relax. He had spent his whole life as a soldier, fighting for faith without ever being told what to believe. All they had ever been told was to follow orders. But what was it all for? By the time he had come to his senses, his wife had already left him. The leader gently reassured him, "It's okay." They were just glad he decided to stay here. At that moment, Alex had just returned to his resting room and by chance noticed the recorder on the desk. On the other side, the general was also using one. Alex had been out of contact for 3 days. He had suggested to his superiors that the door be closed, but his proposal was rejected by the high-ranking officials. The sacrifice of a few was deemed acceptable, and they had already chosen the next soldier. The general looked helpless, but Alex could hear the recording. It turns out they had been lying. The door was still there, but it could only be seen at night. That was why the leader had taken him there during the day. The captain explained that it was the best course of action. Once they returned, the military would act immediately. This place would soon be filled with troops and experts, and the truth could no longer be concealed. There were ways to make them speak, so after understanding the situation here, they all agreed not to go back. This was the real Eden. Alex still hadn't changed his mind. Seeing that the captain wouldn't let him leave, Alex drew his pistol. The captain sneered, mocking him for always resorting to guns to solve problems, threatening to destroy this place. He ordered the captain to move aside. When the captain stubbornly refused, Alex knocked him out with a punch and ran toward the door. The leader hurried to follow, trying to persuade him that there was nothing left to hold on to and that he must obey the orders. With that, Alex passed through the wall and into the other side. Meanwhile, the military had pieced everything together. The senior officers were discussing this new world, praising Alex for doing his job well and following orders. But Alex was already starting to doubt this decision. The high-ranking officials kept discussing the strategic value of the place, mentioning that no area was out of reach of a nuclear strike. They could move things into this world, and no one would be able to harm them. Hearing this, Alex asked if they let a snake into Eden. The officials were still eager to give orders. Alex overheard the answer from the general, who placed his hand on his shoulder. The general had heard something drop. As he picked up the shoulder insignia from the floor, Alex instantly realized something. Moments later, the lab's red alarm blared. Alex barged in. From the beginning, he had been a soldier who followed orders, but at that moment, he retired. In the astonished gazes of those around him, he picked up a piece of metal and smashed the maintenance machine. Before the door could close, he squeezed through. The leader welcomed Alex back. They couldn't be sure if another door would appear, but the original one was gone for good. Alex was meant to live his life as a retiree now. In that moment, he understood one thing. Perhaps the only true paradise is a place untouched by humanity. The seventh story begins with a pilot named Thomas piloting the spaceship when suddenly an alarm blared loudly. A 45 kilograms unauthorized object had been hidden in the cargo hold. Thomas quickly activated the weapon switch and cautiously moved toward the rear cargo hold. Since the spaceship was loaded with supplies, it was an easy target for pirates. After confirming that there was no one in the aft area, he aimed his gun at the hatch and slowly twisted the handle, immediately entering a defensive stance. A girl stepped out suddenly. Thomas almost lost his composure. This was a cargo flight to Woden, and of course the girl knew that. She was there to see her brother, who worked on an investigation team in Woden. They hadn't seen each other for 5 years since he left Earth, and they wouldn't be reunited for another year. But she missed him so much that she had to sneak aboard the spaceship. Thomas's face darkened as he removed the magazine. This was no longer just a violation of regulations. The girl, named Marilyn, could buy a ticket, and she even had a P-level computer license, which might come in handy. At that moment, the spaceship sped up. Thomas shut off the deceleration engine to save some fuel. Marilyn asked why. Thomas picked up the microphone to contact the headquarters commander, who slowly appeared on the screen. The spaceship had a stowaway and couldn't follow standard procedures. This situation was different from before. Marilyn wasn't a criminal or a smuggler. She just wanted to see her brother in Woden. The commander looked troubled. Thomas asked if there were any other ships nearby. The commander shook his head. The distance was simply too great. Thomas tried to argue for launching another ship, but the commander refused. Marilyn realized the seriousness of the situation, and Thomas informed her that the ship was carrying a serum for Calla's disease, a fast-acting and painful disease similar to meningitis. Woden urgently needed the serum, as 35 people were waiting for it, and the spaceship had to deliver it on schedule. Marilyn didn't fully understand, but a woman's voice soon came over the speaker, requesting to confirm the suspect's identity. Marilyn removed the ID disc from her neck, and Thomas inserted it into the system. The identification appeared on the screen, and the woman confirmed the execution time. Marilyn angrily demanded to know what that meant. Thomas stood in front of her and listened. The task of launching the escape pod must be completed as soon as possible. The woman's signal slowly cut off. That was the rejection order. Marilyn couldn't calm down, and Thomas took the blame, admitting he should have informed her earlier. But he thought perhaps the commander could do something, yet nothing had changed. The system alerted that the spaceship's supplies were running low, and time was running out. Marilyn began crying in sadness. She hadn't harmed anyone. She just wanted to see her brother. Thomas explained that this was an emergency situation. The spaceship only had just enough fuel to reach the destination, and they had accounted for extra consumption, but they hadn't considered Marilyn's weight. The ship was about to break apart, and both of them would die, along with the 35 people waiting for the serum. Marilyn suggested throwing some supplies out, but those were medical supplies and food. Without them, hundreds of people at the base would die. Thomas was willing to do anything useful, but now that they were in Woden's gravity well, they had to act quickly. The images in his mind felt like a series of numbers. They were facing a simple math problem. The fuel couldn't get the ship to its destination. The mass of m plus x was that simple, and Marilyn was the x, the unknown in the equation. She suggested that she could sacrifice herself. She could take the serum to Woden, but the ship didn't have a landing computer, and Marilyn couldn't fly it alone. Everything was finely designed, and they had nothing else they could jettison. Suddenly, Thomas had an idea. He quickly used a laser to cut open the hatch and removed the spare medical kits. He discarded whatever could be thrown away. The escape pod was soon filled with various items, though it was unclear if it was enough to balance the weight. Thomas moved to the control panel, pressed a button, and waited for the hatch to close completely. He hit the confirmation button, and both of them anxiously awaited the result. The screen displayed 24 kilograms. Marilyn finally lost hope. This was less than half of what was needed. A cold string of numbers flashed on the screen. They had less than an hour left. Now that they were in communication range, Marilyn could try to contact her brother. Thomas quickly contacted the Woden base, requesting them to notify Marilyn's brother so he could speak with the ship. Meanwhile, Marilyn felt an overwhelming chill. She shouldn't have done this. Maybe she should have just waited on Earth. She couldn't stop herself from breaking down. Thomas knew she wasn't to blame. This was all his fault. He sincerely apologized. Marilyn finally stopped crying, and soon her brother's face appeared on the screen. She quickly wiped her tears away and greeted him with a smile. She had missed him so much. The brother was overjoyed to see his sister, but how could she be on the spaceship? Marilyn gave a bitter smile, admitting she had snuck aboard. Her brother's face darkened. His sister had no idea of the consequences, and all he felt was regret and anger. Marilyn just wanted to see him for a moment. She didn't want him to feel guilty. Thomas had tried everything, but no one could help her fix this. She still wanted to say goodbye to her brother. As the ship gradually lost communication with the base, Marilyn poured out her longing for her brother. Although they would never meet again, she would always be with him in spirit, hoping he would understand that. The brother struggled to hold back his tears, nodding in agreement. He promised she would never be replaced by anything or anyone. The communication signal completely cut off. Marilyn stood up and walked to the rear of the ship. The system kept warning of low fuel, indicating they were in a critical state. She accepted her fate. Thomas pressed the hatch button and Marilyn walked inside, then confirmed the closure. With one last glance before departure, the hatch sealed tightly. After several moments of hesitation, Thomas finally pulled the lever and pressed the final confirmation button. The spaceship fell into an eerie silence. Thomas took out her identity disc, the only thing the girl had left behind. The system had regained balance and all functions were operating normally. The ship would reach Woden in half an hour. Thomas couldn't hold back his tears anymore. His emotions overwhelmed him. He had just killed a girl, all to balance a cold equation. The 8th story begins with a broke vagrant, Simon, returning home and eagerly pressing a few buttons. He'd been unemployed for a long time, and his benefits had expired on February 17th. Even though he could keep calling, the woman on the other end was utterly powerless. Simon didn't complain or get angry. He packed whatever he could sell into a cardboard box. After a brief internal struggle, even his precious watch was not spared. He needed the money too badly. Times had changed, and employment wasn't guaranteed anymore. Simon was simply one of the many who'd been left behind. He took the box to an antique shop, hoping to get a decent price for its contents, though there wasn't much inside. The shop owner, Mr. Quint, only offered him $50. Simon couldn't accept this price, but Mr. Quint reminded him that he wouldn't get more anywhere else, and Simon would need to add $5 to make up the difference. After agreeing to the deal, Mr. Quint asked if there was anything else, but Simon had nothing left except the pain in his heart. Mr. Quint, looking intrigued, led him to a hidden room. It was a memory extraction device, a trendy gadget among the wealthy. The process was simple. Scan a person's memories and copy them to a computer. For example, a skier could relive the thrill of a race by experiencing the memory of it firsthand. But memories weren't perfect. Repeated use made them blurry, and eventually they would vanish. So someone had developed a stronger experience, electronic memory extraction, which allowed you to store and relive memories, whether from an hour ago or a year ago. It was a painful experience and, of course, illegal. Mr. Quint assured Simon that the payment would be reasonable. Simon was curious about how much he could make. Mr. Quint replied it depended on what others were looking for, as well as how interesting the memory was. Simon decided to think it over. Mr. Quint reminded him to carefully consider what memories he might have that would sell well. After hearing this, Simon left and was just stepping through his door when the screen flickered. It was a reminder. The rent was due on the 1st of the month, and today was already the 6th. If the landlord didn't get the rent by tomorrow, he'd be kicked out. With the brief notification over, Simon sulked back into his apartment. For dinner, he only made a bowl of thin gruel, which tasted surprisingly good, but just as he turned away, a cockroach fell from the cupboard and landed in his bowl. Simon froze. Seeing it wriggling around was the last straw. He rushed back to the antique shop where Mr. Quint greeted him with a strange smile. Mr. Quint had just received a great offer. Someone was collecting high school diplomas. A memory flashed before Simon's eyes, the principal handing him his diploma and a watch as a reward for leading a fundraising event years ago. Simon snapped out of his painful reverie as Mr. Quint removed the memory extraction device. The transfer was perfect. Simon didn't feel much different, but there was a small gap in his memory. He couldn't recall anything from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., just 12 hours of his life. But now, he was richer. Simon still hadn't fully recovered from the extraction when Mr. Quint was already looking forward to the next deal, but Simon wasn't interested. It was a last resort. As a temporary relief, Simon went back to his cramped apartment and paid the rent in full. Just as he was about to close the door, the landlord mentioned new policies coming next month. Many temporary residents would be passing through, and they would need to pay several months in advance. Simon didn't have that kind of money, but the landlord didn't care. If Simon couldn't pay, the apartment would be rented out to someone else. Reluctantly, Simon paid again. He wanted to ask about finding a job, but the woman on the screen said there were no openings in his area. If one came up, he'd be notified. She ended the call, and Simon realized his money was running low. As he flipped through an old photo album, a pained expression crossed his face. He couldn't remember any of these things due to the memory extraction. He had no choice but to return to the antique shop once more, this time for a birthday gift. As the stars flickered on the screen, his mother's voice echoed in his mind, a memory from his 5th birthday. But that wasn't enough. A girl appeared before him. It was his first date. They'd promised to never forget, yet he had lost that memory. The woman appeared on the screen again, offering a job at an auto repair shop. The records showed that Simon qualified, but he needed to answer a few strict questions. She asked what high school he graduated from. Simon quickly answered. As for his major, the question made his expression sour. He tried to think carefully, but before he could, the woman provided the answer herself. She reminded him that time was running out and asked about his college education in the field. Simon tried to speak, but found himself unable to. The woman, unable to get a detailed response, concluded that he wasn't ready for work yet. The unemployment rate was 32%, and many applicants were after that job. She told him to resubmit his application. That was the breaking point for Simon. Simon returned to the antique shop just as Mr. Quint was finishing a deal with a tearful woman. It turned out Mr. Quint wasn't just harvesting Simon's memories, he was collecting volumes and variety to ride out market swings. When Simon tried to slip away, Mr. Quint sneered, telling him to save his breath. Even if he walked out now, he would be back in a few days. Mr. Quint was convinced of it, so much so that Simon spun around and glared at him. Simon admitted the truth. He'd come back only because a loaf of bread cost $5 here, and only the black market could justify that markup. It was Mr. Quint and his kind manipulating prices under the guise of fair payment. Why should a minute of life be worth 5 cents? And why was his very existence tagged with a price? Still, Simon knew he'd chosen this path. Mr. Quint hadn't forced him. He stepped forward and asked what he was buying today. Mr. Quint said he just wanted one memory, his first hormone game with his girl. Simon recoiled and shook his head. Mr. Quint shrugged, saying he would pay top dollar. If he didn't want a deal, he'd best walk away now. But Simon's mind drifted back to that night, the girl's tender smile as she sat next to him in the car. He'd chosen to trade the memory away, and how precious that moment had been. She'd wanted him to say he loved her, and when he finally did, she'd leaned in close, her whole body melting toward him. By the time Mr. Quint told him to grab the cash and leave, Simon hadn't wanted the memory extraction to end, but the machine whisked it away before he could stop it. As he staggered back to reality, he caught a flicker of light on the computer screen, his memory stored in data form. Mr. Quint warned him not to touch it, but Simon only gave a bitter laugh. He'd pledged to remember their first meeting forever, and now he'd broken that promise. Mr. Quint assumed Simon wanted to relive the memory. What Simon really wanted was to reclaim it, to bring that girl back into his life. Desperate, Simon lunged at him. Mr. Quint grabbed for the pistol in the box, but Simon was quicker. He drew it and leveled the barrel at Mr. Quint's chest. Simon growled that Mr. Quint's machines could store memories, but they couldn't price his life. But Mr. Quint told him that his memory wasn't even here anymore. Simon said he had nothing left to lose. He just wanted his life back. He racked around into the chamber. Mr. Quint sighed, telling him, "There's only one way, but it's not perfect." Simon let out a manic laugh. The scene shifts to Simon sitting at his cheap desk in a crisp suit. The screen flickered, indicating that a new application from Simon was received. The operator noted Simon's impressive typing skills and added more potential job matches. She asked where Simon learned his typing skills. Strangely, Simon replied after he finished his college, he went to high school, not once, but twice. Before she could question the odd progression, Simon rattled off more credentials. His 5th birthday party, 2 children, stints as a translator and a secretary, fluent German. It turns out Simon was fused with a patchwork of stolen memories rather than his own. The ninth story begins with a strange patient named Jean arriving at the hospital that morning. She refused any touch, hurriedly put on dark sunglasses, and kept asking where the doctor was. She insisted that time was running out. When the physician finally appeared, she whispered that it was too late and she was blind. Moments ago, her eyes had been fine. Now they saw nothing. Dr. Eddie escorted her to a private ward while a nurse named Claire found the whole thing odd but carried on. At the front desk, an elderly man's wife was suffering chest pains, but without insurance or any payment guarantee, hospital policy forbade admission. Claire sympathized but couldn't bend the rules, and the couple had to leave. The man muttered his complaints as they walked away. Eddie overheard and shook his head. Claire just sighed. Policies were policies, and patients had to understand. Then a nurse paged Claire that the blind woman wanted to speak with her, so Claire hurried back up to the ward. Jean sat on the edge of her bed, bewildered. When Claire asked what was wrong, Jean insisted Claire sit down first, even though Claire had paperwork piling up. Jean explained they looked so much alike, yet they had never met. Claire thought she was delirious. Jean went on, saying they were unique because they both followed every rule, did their jobs without a thought for themselves or each other. Claire just thought Jean had been through a lot, but she couldn't help but wonder who this mysterious Jean really was. Just then, the hospital received word of another patient, a call that had come in an hour earlier. Jean wasn't the first to go blind. Her husband had just stumbled through the doors, pale and disoriented. It looked alarmingly like an infectious outbreak. Strangely, Jean had abandoned him and rushed in alone, and her husband had fainted at home, only regaining consciousness long enough to dial for help. Eddie suspected Jean knew more than she was saying. A nurse gently steered Jean's husband into the corridor. All he wanted was an explanation. Eddie shrugged helplessly and the man snarled. His anger flared as he called for his wife, only to realize she'd left him behind. His fury drained into resignation. He didn't care what happened to Jean now. Claire frowned, but before she could react, the nurse returned, saying Jean's husband was only one of many. Patients were pouring into the first-floor hallway, everyone suddenly blind and clamoring for doctors. By morning, the condition had surged through every ward, overwhelming the staff. Victims described their vision as if a thick flesh curtain had descended over their eyes. Ophthalmologists dubbed it stone blindness, but as cases climbed into the thousands, experts admitted they were powerless. All they knew was that the Disease Control Center had called an emergency summit. When Eddie pressed for leads, he was told a medical expert had been dispatched to investigate and should be back by now. In truth, the expert had returned, but blind too. The room went silent as scientists realized there was no clear transmission pattern. Without a known vector, terror would soon sweep the city. All they could do was wait for someone to pinpoint a cause before acting. On day 3, Claire climbed the stairs to Jean's room. At the sound of her knock, Jean beamed and asked about her health. Claire wondered if Jean really did know the outbreak's origin. Jean whispered she could tell her how this disease started. She leaned forward, saying people once had compassion, outrage when others suffered, a need to help. But now they had cut themselves off, refusing to see the pain around them until their eyes actually go dark. Claire shook her head in disbelief and changed the subject, asking about Jean's husband. Jean's voice cracked as she explained. Her husband had gotten word of his mother's death and reacted as if it meant nothing. In that instant, he too blinded himself. She'd fled here alone to save others, and now she had also turned blind. Claire felt a flicker of doubt. By day 4, specialists reported that the eyes themselves were unharmed, but enveloped in a living membrane. Perhaps surgical removal could restore sight. They warned that at the current rate, cases would top 100,000 within days. One senior doctor conjectured that stone blindness wasn't an infection at all, but a latent mutation triggered by an environmental change. A nearby physician cracked a joke and Claire's stomach nodded. Then the chief scientist's phone buzzed. He read the dispatch, eyebrows rising in horror. Just hours before the first patient fell ill, an Alaskan bioresearch lab had exploded, releasing unstable bacteria into the air, likely the culprit. As he processed the news, his words slowed. He too had gone blind. The room fell into stunned silence. Not even the experts were immune. That evening, Claire sat alone on a worn sofa, long past her shift with no excuse to go home. Her marriage was a quiet separation, no shouting, just silence. Now she was forced to think. Jean had been right. They were all turning blind to humanity. Eddie called it nonsense. Claire realized she no longer saw patients as individuals. They didn't live, they existed. Eddie protested that she was just doing her job, but Claire saw through it. Hiding behind policy and insurance, they were lying to themselves, abandoning compassion in the name of work. Eddie urged Claire to calm down. They had all just heard the report. The bacteria was most likely the cause of the stone blindness, but the report didn't fully explain why some people were affected while others weren't as susceptible. Eddie quickly quickly interrupted the conversation, suggesting that Claire was just exhausted and that it would be best for her to go home and get some rest. Claire reluctantly agreed, thinking maybe the experts would figure everything out. Eddie let out a relieved sigh, but just as they were about to leave, Claire suddenly screamed in pain. Eddie rushed to her side, trying to figure out what was wrong. By day 6, there was still no cure for the blindness. Eddie ran into Jean and asked if she could visit Claire. Jean agreed eagerly. She was excited to see Claire, saying she'd soon be able to see again. The surgery had a 100% success rate, and the doctors were set to operate in the afternoon. Claire's turn would be tomorrow. Jean asked when Claire's surgery was scheduled. Claire shook her head, explaining that they wouldn't perform surgery on her. Surgery wasn't the real solution. It was a temporary fix at best. Once the surgical solution ran out, what would they do next? Jean had no answer. Eddie, noticing the time, suggested they leave. He gently helped Jean out of the room, but then Jean stopped and asked if they weren't going to operate on Claire. Eddie said the surgery wouldn't solve the problem, but he still believed Claire would see again. It would just take a little more time. It was a perplexing dilemma. Eddie's judgment was spot on. Claire had made her choice, chosen the hospital policies, and turned blind to humanity. The call for humanity, or a simple sense of responsibility, had led Claire to this point, and it was only she who could break free from the darkness that had confined herself in that way. The 10th story begins with a man named John, who had just splashed water on his face in the bathroom when he noticed something odd, a hidden camera behind the mirror. He was stunned. He wanted to call his wife, but as he turned around, a repairman was walking toward him, profusely apologizing and starting to reinstall the mirror. John couldn't hold back any longer. He asked the repairman what was going on with the camera. The repairman quickly dodged the question, trying to change the subject. Seeing that John wasn't letting him off easily, the repairman muttered something about needing to hurry or else his boss wouldn't be happy. John froze. How could the repairman know his boss's name? The repairman quickly backtracked, claiming he had mistaken John for someone else, but John wasn't going to let him go that easily. He demanded to know what the repairman had been doing behind the mirror. The repairman gave an exaggerated shrug, saying it was just routine maintenance. He refused to admit anything beyond that. The repairman tried to shift the conversation again, but John grabbed him, not wanting to waste any more time. He turned to leave, planning to call the police. Finally, the repairman agreed to talk, but only in the closet. John was confused, but the repairman explained that the closet was out of the camera's range. They quickly retreated into the closet. The repairman seemed to be taking a big risk, knowing that if this came to light, he'd lose everything. John was still in the dark. The repairman pointed to the initials on John's shirt, which stood for John's name. It turned out that this was John's own TV show, one that aired 24/7, with a huge fan base across the country. People watched his show even in the middle of the night just to see him sleep. John was dumbfounded, wondering who would watch that. The repairman explained that wherever John went, cameras were placed. He added, with a knowing look, John was stunned. The scope of this was way too much. The repairman said it was a special pay-per-view feature and that minors were prohibited from subscribing. John couldn't believe it. The repairman said he'd said too much and turned to leave. As he tried to exit, John stopped him, claiming he'd never been told about any of this. The repairman explained that if John had known, the show would have been much more different. Everyone had to sign a contract to ensure they wouldn't leak secrets. Just then, the repairman's radio crackled, and he hurriedly left. John still hadn't recovered from the shock. He rushed to his wife and asked if she'd seen the man who walked into the bathroom. He'd just spent 10 minutes with him in the closet. But his wife seemed unfazed. She said she had to get to work and then leaned in to whisper to him not to mess up the ratings. The words hit him like a thunderclap. His wife knew it all along. Trying to stay calm, John wandered into the living room pretending to look for his keys while secretly searching for more hidden cameras. He found nothing near the sofa, but when he checked behind a framed painting, there it was, another camera. He placed it on the table. Then, eyeing a large potted plant, he checked inside, and sure enough, another camera. After uncovering a third one, the phone rang. A woman's voice on the other end calmly told him to refrain from damaging company property. John didn't care. Furious, he hung up, then spotted yet another camera by the front door. Before he could react, two large men appeared outside, dragged him out, and tossed him into a broadcast van. The repairman was already inside. The repairman blamed him for messing with the equipment and involving them in serious trouble. He pointed up at a camera mounted in the van, showing that the show was still live. As they drove through town, they passed a group of girls on the roadside, waving signs and screaming in chicken voices. They were John's fans. Emotions that had been pent up for 5 years erupted. No one knew John better than they did. They looked like they'd break into the van just to hug him. Police rushed in to keep the crowd at bay, but the girls chased the van, refusing to let go. At the broadcasting building, John was led inside and noticed a remote control on a desk. The repairman told him to go try it. John clicked a button and his own face appeared on the monitor. He tried changing the channel, but nothing happened. It was his show. Then he was taken into another room, where a man greeted him with a smile and a handshake before inviting him to sit. But the man's tone quickly changed, asking what exactly he thought he was doing since this was a multi-million-dollar business. He explained that when John first appeared on the show 5 years ago, a 30-second ad slot cost $100. Now, it was $10,000. The network had built John up over time, and just when they'd finally turned a profit, John was threatening to destroy everything. John looked ashamed for a moment, but then remembered that he was the one being exploited. He assumed this man was the mastermind, but the man shook his head, saying this was all up to the viewers. They decided when he woke up, what he wore, even where he worked, everything. John exploded, saying his life shouldn't be broadcast and he had a right to privacy. The man just laughed, saying there was no privacy for a celebrity like him. And celebrities became famous because they were on television. It's that simple. The more people see him, the more famous he becomes. The company had bet on John and won. When he lost his job 2 years ago, ratings soared. People wanted to see what would happen next. So the company stepped in and arranged a new job for him, all based on viewer demand. The man said coincidences weren't real since they planned everything. And there's a whole department dedicated to creating these happy accidents. Even John's wife was part of it too. John was stunned. The man continued, saying if he really wanted to walk away, just know he would be putting thousands of people out of work. But John stood firm, saying he wanted his privacy back. The man didn't argue. He simply ordered a car to take John home. As they pulled up, a woman waved at the window. Curious, John opened it, only for her to leap inside. She was a die-hard fan, watching his show 14 hours a day. She begged for an autograph and, more disturbingly, said she wanted to have a fat baby with him. Then she started undressing, ready for round 1 of 300. John panicked and shoved her heavy body back out. Outside, even more fans were waiting. The repairman squeezed in and quickly shut the door behind him, muttering that he had been fired. John apologized, saying he didn't mean for things to spiral out of control. He asked if there was anything he could do for him. The repairman snatched an autograph from John, saying this would do. When John finally got home, the living room was full of flowers, gifts from fans. The repairman pulled out a check, saying this was the paycheck for his 5 years of work. Now that the show had ended, it was time to dismantle the equipment. But just as he was about to leave, the repairman paused. He pulled John into the closet again, asking if the cancellation was just a cover. He gave John a long, meaningful look, then left without another word. John stood in silence, a cold chill creeping up his spine. He looked around the room again and searched, wondering if this part was another show. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.